I woke up drenched in a cold sweat. Moonlight was flooding in through the blinds, and a distant rumble was foreshadowing rain. The bedsheet stuck to my skin as I felt under the covers for my phone, the sudden bright light making me flinch. It was 4:34 a.m., only 10 minutes later than the previous night. I sunk back into my pillow, exasperated. I'd been having the same dream for the better half of the week. Well, more of a nightmare, really. It always started out quite pleasant. I'd be sitting at a diner, enjoying a filet mignon and a glass of red wine, when the little gold bell above the door would ring, and a man would step inside. He'd walk up to the bar and whisper to the waitress, and then they would both turn and look at me. Suddenly, my food would taste bitter, and I'd look down only to see the vermin defiling my plate. At first, I thought the universe might be trying to tell me something. I'd looked up bad dream interpretations online, hoping to shed some light on my subconscious. But the only explanation I had found was adamant about the presence of a toxic relationship. I couldn't take it seriously after that. Jimmy and I had been over for nearly 3 years, and I had been the one to call it quits after he'd surprised me with a shared burial plot for Valentine's Day. I winced at that memory. Certainly, I had better things to do than reminisce, and I knew sleep wouldn't find me again, so I threw on my nightrobe and trudged downstairs in search of breakfast. It was only 8 o'clock in the morning, but the office was already bustling with energy. As soon as I stepped out from the elevator, William rushed over to share the latest statistical reports. I furrowed my brow. Can't these wait? He clicked his tongue impatiently.
Afraid not. Pete wants him in by noon.
He shoved the folder at me and disappeared into one of the adjoining rooms. I wrung my hands in frustration. I was going to be doing interviews today, and I hadn't even had so much as a whiff of my morning coffee. Amelia was already waiting for me as I stormed into the room.
Right. You have 2 missed calls, a meeting with Harvey E. after lunch, and 3 applicants starting at 9 o'clock.
She sounded as though she'd been rehearsing it for the past half hour. Amelia was our most recent hire. She was fresh out of college and clearly had no idea what she was doing. Right. I slapped the reports folder onto the table. I am dying for a coffee. Would you be so kind? I didn't even have to finish my sentence. Amelia was out the door, and I heard the click-clack of her heels down the corridor. She had returned shortly after I sat down at my desk.
The first interviewee is here,
she announced in her high-pitched tone. I glanced at my watch. It was only 20 past 8. The interview was scheduled for 9 o'clock, I pointed out matter-of-factly. Amelia blushed and tugged at the hem of her skirt.
They're very eager to meet you.
Her tone was almost apologetic. I sighed and waved my hand dismissively. All right then, call them in. I shifted some papers around on my desk impatiently as Amelia strutted down the corridor. Within 20 seconds, there was a light knock on my door. Come on in, I called. I was expecting a fidgety, high-strung individual, but he was tall and lean, with deep chestnut hair gelled neatly into place. He looked about 35. I stood to greet him and gestured to the empty chair facing me. Take a seat, please. I couldn't help noticing how self-assured he was. Both his stride and the classic fit suit he was wearing radiated confidence. I consulted my applicant list and put on my best "I love my job" smile. How are you today, Chris? I hoped I'd gotten his name right. Amelia had forgotten to give me the heads up, but he seemed totally unfazed.
I'm doing great. How are you?
He leaned back in his chair, a relaxed grin on his face. His features seemed vaguely familiar, giving me an odd sense of déjà vu. I was generally rather good with faces and hated not being able to pinpoint it. What if he was expecting me to recognize him? Quickly, I ran down a mental list of places I'd visited over the past few days. Had I seen him in the milk aisle in Junebury? Or was he the guy who ran out of change at the gas station on 5th? Actually, hadn't he gone out with my friend Lisa last month?
Have I messed up already?
He was eyeing me quizzically, a smirk lining his features. I caught a glimpse of myself in my laptop screen. My brow was furrowed, my lips pursed. Come to think of it, I probably looked quite angry. No, not at all. I chuckled awkwardly and clicked my tongue. Let me introduce myself, Chris. My name is Madeline, and I am responsible for our HR department. As you are undoubtedly aware, we are currently looking for someone with previous experience in the field to fill our customer representative position. I looked at him expectantly.
Very well.
He grinned, a dimple forming in his cheek.
I believe I am qualified for the job.
Well, your resume certainly looks impressive. I tapped the printout with my fingernail. It says here you graduated from...
With honors.
He cut me off, nodding amiably. He looked so at ease it was challenging for me to maintain my professional composure. And it says here... I looked up at him. You spent 10 years working for a communications company. Could you tell me a bit about your position there?
I was their customer service representative. Mostly dealt with returns and, well, snappy clients.
He chuckled to himself.
There is a letter of recommendation on the second page.
I couldn't help smiling. Okay, Chris, so what sets you apart from the other applicants? Why should we hire you? I observed him curiously. It was a trick question, but he took no time to think.
I'm very thorough with my work. I commit until the end and hold myself to a very high standard.
He paused thoughtfully.
I'm also a brilliant magician. I collect vinyl records and grill a mean steak.
I froze as the last puzzle piece fell into place. Steak. That was where I remembered him from. The man who had been haunting my dreams every night for the past week was sitting in front of me with a grin on his face and asking for a job. A mix of anticipation and apprehension washed over me as questions flooded my mind. Was I a psychic? Should I be worried? Should this affect my decision?
Is everything all right?
He looked bemused. It's nothing. I was aware I was stumbling over my words. Thank you for coming in today, Chris. You can come sign the paperwork tomorrow morning. I'll make sure Amelia gets it ready for you. His face lit up.
I got the job?
I stood up and held my hand out to him. Welcome aboard. He happily obliged, shaking my hand and gathering his belongings to leave. But he must have changed his mind on the way because he suddenly turned to face me, an odd look in his eyes. Did you have a question, Chris? He winced slightly at my impatient tone.
I did, actually.
He paused for effect.
A restaurant has just opened on Valewood Avenue. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner this evening.
I was so taken aback, I felt my cheeks flame red. That's very thoughtful of you, Chris, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline. Our company doesn't condone workplace romances. I was half expecting him to apologize and move on, but he continued standing there, as if he hadn't even heard me.
Actually, I see it as more of a potential business venture.
He explained.
I figured since they're a new company, we could make a pitch. They don't open until 6, so we'd have to go during after hours anyway.
In spite of myself, I felt a pang of dismay. Well, in that case, I'd be happy to come along. We sat across from one another in the dimly lit bistro. The place was bustling with life. Waiters were circling around the tables, and the booths were filled with the sound of clinking glasses and happy chatter. A small queue had formed by the front entrance, and I thought to myself that we had been lucky to even get a table. Chris had ordered a bottle of wine and leaned back in his seat, sipping it.
What do you think?
His eyes gleamed. I nodded approvingly. We should make an offer. He chuckled cordially.
But what do you think of the wine?
Oh, I stiffened. It's delicious, of course.
It's very good.
He agreed.
So, tell me, Madeline, what does a high flyer like yourself do outside of the office?
There was a twinkle in his eye for a second. I felt at a loss for words. This was supposed to be a business meeting, after all. But Chris seemed set on steering the conversation away from work. Well, I do yoga on the weekends, and, I gestured expressively. I suppose reading could be considered one of my main pastimes. I took a sip of wine hurriedly. I didn't like how limited my vocabulary was around Chris. It didn't help that he was conventionally attractive and well-spoken. I had agreed to accompany him on this business endeavor, but Chris didn't look as though he'd had any intention on making a pitch anytime soon, nor could I do anything about it. He was the customer representative, after all.
Are you ready to order?
A waiter in a green apron towered over the table. Chris looked over at me inquisitively.
Have you chosen yet, Madeline?
Truthfully, I hadn't. I'd been too busy analyzing my circumstances and mentally berating myself. I tapped the menu with my fingernail and took a deep breath. I suppose I'll have the chicken tenders and the Greek salad. I said with a half smile.
Very good. And you, sir?
Chris hadn't so much as glanced at the menu.
I'll have the usual, please, Frank.
Certainly, sir.
The waiter nodded and turned to the next table. I watched the interaction dumbfounded. What do you mean, the usual? I demanded. I thought this place only just opened. He grinned, baring his teeth.
Tonight's the opening night. I own it.
My jaw dropped. You own it? But then, why did you apply for the position? He sighed and looked down at the table, clearly ill at ease.
I am the owner, Madeline, not an employee. It's still the early days, and this place cost a small fortune to open.
Of course, that makes sense. I stared at my drink, my cheeks prickling.
I'll get us another bottle.
He stood up and walked over to the bar. With each sip of wine, I could feel the professional setting fading away into oblivion. He told me about his childhood summer spent in his aunt's ranch, and I told him about my ex-boyfriend Jimmy and how his proclamation of undying love had literally killed our relationship. We were just about to get started on our dinner when Chris looked at me quizzically.
Do you have any allergies?
There was an edge of seriousness to his voice, but it took me a moment to realize he wasn't joking. What? Not that I know of, I stuttered. His expression was grave.
My late wife had severe reactions to certain
He hesitated, searching for a suitable word.
irritants.
Oh, was all I could manage. I'm so sorry. The conversation dwindled away into silence. I didn't know you were married, I said after a short pause. I realized this wasn't the wisest thing to say given the circumstances. After all, why wouldn't he be married?
For a couple of years.
He specified.
She passed away last month. I found it exceedingly difficult to deal with.
I couldn't believe how quickly the conversation had shifted. I stared down at my half-empty glass, wondering what I could possibly say to make things better. I could feel him watching me intently.
I apologize. It's been tough.
No, I understand, I said, mortified. Is there anything I can do? I meant this, of course, as a gesture of kindness. I knew I had no prospects of soothing a grieving man's conscience, but a shadow momentarily crossed his features.
Let me cook for you tomorrow night.
I arrived at his house at about 7 p.m. the following evening. I'd stopped by a liquor store on the way and bought a bottle of wine that I'd hoped would complement the meal. I wasn't at all sure why I felt compelled to do this, or why I felt so drawn to this man despite my strict stance against office romances. I suppose I felt bad about the way things had turned out the previous night and couldn't bring myself to revoke the support I had already offered. It was a semi-modern 2-story building surrounded by trees and juniper shrubs. I parked my car in the driveway and started up the stone steps leading to the front door. I rang the doorbell, and within moments, Chris greeted me with a happy smile and ushered me inside. I handed him the bottle of wine apprehensively.
Thank you, Madeline. This'll work perfectly.
He was wearing an apron over a gray crew neck.
Dinner's almost ready.
I took off my coat and reached for the rack. Smells good. What is it?
It's a surprise. My specialty.
He chuckled, disappearing into the kitchen. His house wasn't exactly what I had been expecting. I'd imagined a modern interior, minimalist furniture, and abstract paintings. Instead, his living space looked, well, lived in. Books were strewn across the coffee table, and glass mugs sat in seemingly objectable places. I perched on the couch, taking in my surroundings, when Chris came waltzing in through the door carrying 2 glasses of wine.
Oh, my apologies for the mess.
He said, collecting the books and sticking them back into a random bookshelf.
Ran out of time to clean.
You should see my apartment. I sipped the wine happily as he dashed from one side of the room to the other, like a hurricane, but picking things up in its wake. You have a lovely home. He halted for a second.
Thank you. It was my wife's. She always took such great care of it.
I tensed up, not wanting to repeat last night's conversation. What's this? I pointed to a book on the coffee table, hoping it would serve as a worthwhile distraction. It was open on a page with pictures of wires and gadgets I didn't know the names of. He suddenly seemed flustered.
Oh, that's just an old wilderness survival manual I found in the garage a while ago.
he said, snatching it off the table and shoving it into a bookshelf. Then he straightened up and smiled.
Would you care to accompany me to the dining room?
As I sat down on one of the cushioned chairs in the dining room, Chris came in carrying 2 steaming plates and set them down on the table in front of me.
I do hope you enjoy it, Madeline. This recipe has been in my family for many decades.
I stared at the plate of food. It looked like a slab of meat with a side of mashed potatoes and garden salad. Chris was eyeing me intently as he sat across from me, picking up his utensils.
Well, tuck in.
I arranged my expression into what I'd hoped was a friendly smile. It looks absolutely delicious. Might I ask what it is? Chris looked blasé as ever as he shoveled food into his mouth.
It's a type of filet mignon. Madeline, I must say, your taste in wine is impeccable.
He raised his glass for a toast, but I sat, unmoving, suddenly overcome with an overwhelming urge to gag. The meat looked dense and colorless in the center, and the smell was faintly off-putting. Chris was looking at me curiously now, his arms still up in the air. I started to panic. Was this what he had meant when he'd asked about my allergies? Sorry, could I use your bathroom, please? I tried my best to sound casual. He nodded mid-chew.
It's down the hall. First door on the left.
I nodded and scurried away as nonchalantly as my gut would allow. As soon as I was out of sight, I darted towards the front door. My pulse was throbbing in my throat as I grabbed my belongings and tried the handle. It was locked. My heart dropped. Of course it was locked. What was I expecting? I could still hear the indistinct clicking of utensils coming from the dining room. He was distracted. I still had some time. I stalked down the corridor and tried the first door on the left. It was the bathroom, but to my dismay, it had no windows. I shut the door as meticulously as I could and tried the next one down. It led to a flight of stairs leading to what I can only imagine was the basement. My heart leapt in my chest as I recalled parking my car in front of the garage. I knew this was my way out. I shut the door behind me and felt for the light switch. I found it in the form of a string dangling above my head. As I climbed down the stairs, I started to feel sick again. A putrid smell of rot was radiating from the basement and instantly reminded me of the food that was still awaiting my return from the bathroom. The downstairs was cluttered with boxes, recycling bags, and general trinkets that hadn't qualified for upstairs. I made my way to the only available door, navigating the obstacle course as carefully as I could. I pushed it open, only to be hit with an overwhelming surge of rancid stench. I coughed and sputtered, covering my face with my hands as I gasped for air. I wish I had kept my eyes covered. An elongated steel platform stood in the middle of the room. A fluorescent lamp hung over it, enveloping everything in brilliant light. A woman lay flat on her back on the steel surface, her arms outstretched to her sides and hanging limply in the air. Her eyes were shut, and her body covered with a white plastic sheet. A lineup of utensils was neatly arranged on a small tray beside her, and the smell rising from underneath the sheet blatantly gave away her condition.
I see you've met my wife.
I turned abruptly to see Chris standing in the doorway. His tone was icy cold and his eyes piercing.
Couldn't find the bathroom?
I gawked at him, blood draining from my face. He seemed to be staring straight into the depths of my soul.
Didn't care for the steak?
The corners of his mouth twitched. My own mouth felt as dry as a cotton ball. Please, I whispered. He raised his eyebrows at my request.
Oh, it's still there, if you'd like it. I can bring it down if you'd like a change of scenery.
Let me go, I croaked.
You are free to go any time you'd like. Just not the way you came.
My blood ran cold. Here I was, in the garage of a man I met only yesterday morning, a man I had agreed to hire, a man I had ultimately trusted. How had I ended up here in this situation, in a room with a corpse, in a plate full of mystery meat I didn't even want to think about? I knew I was, in all likelihood, going to die. It was only a matter of when and how, because I no longer had the element of surprise. He knew I didn't have a choice. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I lifted my chin and whispered, "May I finish my dinner?" I trudged up the basement stairs with him inches behind me. He was breathing down my neck, watching my every move. My entire life kept flashing before my eyes, making me sick to my stomach, but I knew there was no way he'd allow me to use the bathroom again unsupervised. How could I have been so gullible? Because I had so carelessly betrayed my own values and morals, I'd be forcefully subjected to a similar fate as the woman I'd seen downstairs. Perhaps it was the inescapable nature of my circumstances, or the sound of his footsteps directly behind me that awakened my instincts. As we approached the top step, I turned on my heel and shoved him as hard as my frigid limbs would allow. There was a muffled thud as his back hit the concrete floor. Without hesitation, I slammed the basement door shut and reached for the lock. But of course, there was no key. Frantically, I flew into the dining room where I had left my phone on the table. My serving was still there, looking as gray as ever, but my phone was gone. He'd taken it. I scoured the room for anything I could use. My utensils were still on the table, and I clutched them to my chest protectively. A few moments later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Thud, thud, thud. His steps were in sync with my heartbeat. I hid behind the bathroom door, leaving a barely visible crack to see. The footsteps came to a halt, and the basement door swung open. Chris towered in the doorway, a mocking expression on his face.
Madeline!
He barked and limped into the living room, disappearing from my line of sight and causing my pulse to pick up in anticipation.
Come out, wherever you are.
He was making fun of me. It was all a game to him. I wondered how many other young women had hidden in this very same room and how many of them had seen how the game ended. I clutched the knife and fork closer to my chest. It was only a matter of time before he found me. My stomach lurched at the thought. But the house was dead silent. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own muffled breathing. It felt like minutes had ticked by without a single indication of movement. I prayed the bathroom door wouldn't creak as I pushed it open slowly, half expecting him to pounce and yell, "Peekaboo!" But he didn't. I tiptoed slowly up the stairs to the second floor and tried the first door on the landing. There was a bed in the center of the room and a wardrobe against the left wall. A sudden waft of breeze caressed my flushed skin, and I noticed one of the windows was slightly ajar. I darted towards it in a daze and looked down at the dark street. It was about 20 feet from the ground, and the driveway was paved, not a blade of grass in sight. I looked around desperately and noticed a rain pipe on the right-hand side of the window pane.
Madeline?
He sounded irate now, and I knew the game was nearing its end. I jolted the window open and scrambled onto the windowsill. The ground looked so far away it made my skin crawl.
I'm coming up!
I panicked. My fingers were trembling and my sweaty palms wouldn't allow me to hold onto the pipe firmly enough. Loud, deliberate footsteps came from the stairs, making me shrivel up in fear. I was out of time and out of options. It was either this or the tools in the basement. The door was suddenly kicked open with a loud bang. Chris charged into the room, a shark smile on his face. His eyes widened when he saw my legs dangling from the edge.
What the—
He started, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. I shut my eyes and propelled myself from the second-story window. The wind swooshed through my hair and into my lungs. Then my legs hit the ground and all I could see was darkness. I knelt there for a few seconds, mentally accounting for any damage. There was a dull pain in my right leg, but I brushed it off for a bruise. I looked up at the window I had jumped from. The curtains were swinging loosely in the wind, but there was no sign of him. Alarmed, I struggled to my feet. The pain was more acute as I limped hurriedly towards the main street, turning my head to look back at the front door every few seconds, hastening my pace against the protests of my pulse. Suddenly, there was a screech of tires and a myriad of blinding lights, and then everything went black. I woke up in a white hospital bed, hooked up to several translucent tubes. The sun rays danced on my face, and I raised my arm to shield my eyes. On the other side of the room, a nurse was fervently rummaging through a cupboard. She raised her head at the sound of shifting sheets.
"Oh good, you're awake,"
she said with a quick smile. "What happened?" My voice sounded tiny and subdued. A look of surprise briefly crossed her features.
"You don't recall?"
I shook my head.
"You had a little run-in with a vehicle and broke your leg,"
she said apologetically.
"The driver called for an ambulance, but you had no form of identification on you, so we couldn't contact your family, I'm afraid. Would you like to phone them?"
I nodded, dazed. As soon as she was out of sight, I sat up, scanning my surroundings. I had a pounding headache, and the bright white interior was irritating my eyes. I noticed a gift box sitting on the bedside table. I peered at it unsurely. Hadn't the nurse said that nobody knew who I was? How could I possibly get a gift? Innocuously, I picked it up and examined the tag. For Madeline. Get well soon, it read. I tore away the wrapping paper. Inside was a plain brown box with the words, Bon Appetit, engraved across the top in gold lettering. I had seen similar designs at the local patissier. I admired it for a few moments, and then took off the lid. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching. Just wanted to thank my patrons, Tam B, Jen Miser, Skymara Ravenswood, Melissa Perez, Mr. Sankofa, Leaf Ninja, Roy Larimer, Mr. Creepypasta, Neon Scoundrel, and William Delphin. If you'd like to become a patron, join my Discord, or see my other social media, check out the links in the description below. Also, let me know how I can be praying for you. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Pregnant with something inhuman, and locked in a basement where no one could hear me or find me. I hadn't really thought about my circumstances with self-honesty. I'd chosen to be entirely myself and ignore my surroundings. I had to, just to hear myself think with all of the horrified screaming and nightmarish and mind-breaking laughter of mad women. They say that Asian girls are good for traditional marriage, according to the advertisements. I come from a most traditional family, a family with a tradition of being very poor. I do know where I come from, though. A long line of arranged marriages and shameful scandals. I was a good girl, though. I had always used good manners and spoke the truth. Those were my ways. I told my sister that the arranged marriage to Professor Thaddeus Crispus was more than a little good for our family. I promised her I would be as happy with him as I was with her. We spent that afternoon making daisy chains, and I realized I would never see her again. In our letters, Thaddeus had made it clear that I could not have the in-laws move in with us. I would live there without my family, belonging to him, essentially. It seemed un-American. I thought about those moments as I sat alone in the darkness of my padded cell in his basement. I was the sixth of his young mail-order brides. He had no interest in what a husband should be interested in. Instead, he had locked all of us up in his basement. It was hardly the worst of what he had done to all of us. He hadn't touched us, though. He simply wasn't a normal man. What he wanted was unnatural and horrible. I could feel it growing inside of my womb. The other girls were much further along in their gestations. Sung was already at 11 months of pregnancy when I arrived. I wondered if she was still alive, still pregnant. It was unclear to me why he had shown them all to me. Perhaps my submissiveness and open-minded approach had caught him off guard. It was when I began to scream and crawl away from him and my eyes were filled with swirling terror of him that he decided to lock me in my cage. There were things in jars. We were not his first 6 brides. He had married 5 before us, and they had given birth to the things in the jars. I'd seen those things, and I had seen the 5 places where he had made rectangular cuts into the concrete floor of his basement. He had buried the mothers of those things in unmarked graves under his home. It was moments after all of that became obvious to me, and I panicked. I lost my composure. He had a laboratory in his home, and he kept us in his basement in cells where there were graves and a museum of dead things kept in jars and a birthing room splattered in bloodstains. I thought endlessly of the birthing room. It was a table with leg straps under a light. Plastic sheets made up its 4 walls, and they all had brown splatter marks on them, bloodstains. The drain in the floor had a brown ring, and the light and fan made the plastic sheets move and shimmer evilly and silently, waiting for another. I sat there in my thoughts as my mind worked over the horror of my reality. The other girls had all gone mad, singing, laughing, screaming. It was a madhouse of young women locked up in the darkness and pregnant with inhuman things. I stayed sane because I wanted to, because I realized that I was already insane just because I wanted to be sane in such a nightmare. Who would suffer great agony when painkiller is a choice? My mind could not break because my madness was to not let it go. I stayed there and dwelt on every single moment of the hells I had to go through. What he was making were not entirely human and not entirely something inhuman. They were things made from their mothers' bodies and his blood and the blood of animals. He was making his own species, playing God, becoming the father of a new animal. He said they would replace humans and they would be immortal and immune to disease and unhappiness. He called us all goddesses and told us our sacrifice was a noble one. My options were to accept all of this and go deeper, perhaps finding a bottom, or I could swim back up toward the light. Well, except there was no light. I learned the rest as I thought of his few words to me, and from what I had witnessed and experienced, I knew the thing inside me. I knew that my husband was not a liar, and in his craft he was not blundering. His madness was the evil that was required to use 11 brides to birth monsters for him, even if the monsters were his children. I found my door open and I walked out and sat at a table with him, and we drank tea, and he told me I was very beautiful. I would be the mother of the new ones. He was certain it would be me, and he was very proud of me. I am a virgin mother, I pointed out quietly. Those words pleased him very much, and he smiled. From then on, I was allowed to wander around the basement out of my cell. I used my freedom to get exercise and to remain in better health. I knew he had me under surveillance, so I made no plans or effort to escape. I was sure he could do more than use a needle on a girl. I was right to know this. Someone investigated him. A delivery of packages for our pregnancy needs had gotten the attention of the route driver. This person had assumed the role of heroic investigator and snooped too deeply into Dr. Crispy's affairs, only to wind up breaking in. Apparently, a booby trap of some kind had killed the investigator. I watched as my husband buried the body in his basement next to his 5 brides. When the concrete was cut, there was a smell from the other graves. I made it back to my padded cell before I was sick from the smell. The light from the digging was blocked by his silhouette in the doorway. I trembled and apologized. That's when he explained that the intruder was someone he had found dead, trying to burglarize his laboratory. He had several booby traps for such a purpose, and he later showed them to me. He mentioned that there was a secret entrance to the basement and even a second basement that was empty. He also pointed out that the delivery driver was inevitable and that he was expecting to be investigated. Unfortunately for his brides, there was no real evidence of our existence because he had not legally married any of us under a real name.
I work in a genetics lab and had to steal all of this equipment. Some of it is quite heavy. You would never guess what my real job is, or why it was so easy to deliver all this stuff to my own home.
He concluded. You are too smart. I smiled weakly after all my vomiting.
Thanks. You are my favorite, Song Yu. You are such a good girl.
He smiled and left me there. He had to get rid of some things, the vehicle of the intruder and other stuff. He had left the door to the basement open. I knew better. I lay down and got some rest. When he came home, he found me asleep, and I was gently woken up.
You didn't try to escape?
He realized. Escape? No, husband. I am faithful. I honor my family's agreement with you and everything I said I would do in my letters, I replied.
You're insane.
he muttered absently, almost a whisper. He was fascinated by my calmness. I just want to have the last of my life be what I had wanted. I cannot pretend, but I can be myself, I articulated neatly. I had practiced a conversation with him in my thoughts more than 20,000 times. It was not so difficult after so much rehearsal.
You will not betray me,
He agreed. It is not my way, I swore. From then on, I was allowed upstairs, and when the police were looking for the delivery driver and showed up, I was home. They told me that the person had complained to the police about the many pregnancy supplies and the weirdness of it and then had gone missing. I told them the supplies were for me and my happy pregnancy. When my husband reviewed the surveillance, he was pleased with me for lying to the police.
You lied to the police so convincingly. I knew you could be a liar, but your actions show you truly are honest with me,
He decided. In my heart, I knew there was nothing the police could do to help me or the other brides. They could bring Dr. Crispy to justice, but we stood no chance without his care and serums. The monsters inside us would eat us alive from the inside out without his intervention. The animal DNA he had chosen were all cannibals to their mothers, a trait he selected on purpose for the new ones. It was something I knew because he had mentioned it several times without saying specifically what sort of chimeras were brewing inside of us. I only understood that they were to be specifically sedated once a week, mostly through injections, but sometimes he made changes to our diet to keep us healthy. I doubted any attempt to abort the creatures would be a safe option, and so we were only going to live until it was time to give birth. It took about a year for the full gestation of a new one. That was our fate, unless something was to change. This is my life. I'm here with you and your purpose, I said. He shrugged at me. I cannot escape from what is inside of me, I said. And besides, out there I am a victim. Here, I am a goddess. Dr. Crispy thought I was very amusing and smiled warmly. From then on, he increased my comfort and took better care of me. I even noticed that he made efforts to distance himself from me. He was growing fond of me and my attitude towards my situation. The newer brides needed care, and for a while he showed me how to administer the serums and monitor their diets. I was a fast learner, and while my role was to assist him, I learned all I could. Later, I was too pregnant to assist newly pregnant girls, so I retired from helping him care for them. He was pleased with me, and I seemed more than resigned to him. I seemed content with my fate. I did want justice, however. What he had done to me and the other girls was entirely monstrous. I had become resigned to my fate, cold and numb to it. Any thoughts of survival, any whisper of a dream that I might live and become myself again, only brought terror into my heart. There was an image of me on a shelf somewhere that my family could look at. I could not be her ever again. The thought of getting out alive was the thought that frightened me more than the impending day I was to go to the birthing room. As my pregnancy advanced, however, my thoughts of giving birth in agony to a monster and dying did scare me. I had heard the other girls before me down there in the basement. They began to give birth to the new ones. The first one kept me awake for hours with her screaming, which I could hear despite the soundproofing. Later on, he had to cut concrete and dug up another grave down there. The next brides to give birth were the same. I never got used to it. Each one dying down there was ahead of me and one less. There were two, and then there were none. I was next, and the horror and lingering terror mingled with the agony of the pregnancy's final phases. I had premature labor several times. I was able to get up somehow and follow the sound of cooing into the nursery. The strange version of Dr. Crispy sat there with his children. I stared at them, at him. I couldn't scream because I would explode. My eyes couldn't look away because I was dreaming. My heart couldn't beat because I no longer wished to remain a living creature alive on Earth. I beheld the horror fruit of his work. I turned and went back down to the living room and crawled into the empty fireplace. It felt like the whole world was shaking. The shadows had become living things, speaking in whispers, saying, "This is always the way." And I went into the darkness by turning around from where I stood in my thoughts. For a strange night, I became the goddess of a new one, the mother of an unnatural thing. I made the unnatural natural, and I survived. I performed a miracle. For that, Dr. Crispy worshipped me. When I stood in my blanket of shadows, I was afraid, and I was fear. I trembled and reached out and touched his kneeling forehead with one finger. Inside, I was screaming in unending dread of my own lingering presence, the girl I was before, still part of me trapped in the hells of Dr. Crispy. There was a deathly light in her eyes, the source of my own insanity, the screaming, laughing, singing, and mad version of me. The light exploded out of me as my voice, my will against him, Dr. Crispy, fell backwards. Behind him were the new ones as they hungered for the flesh they came from. It was their nature. I could only laugh as they tore him apart. Somehow I found the little ones to be adorable in their ferocity as they played with their daddy. When they were satisfied, they went to their beds and slept, their bloody claws resting on full bellies and bloody lips curled in smiles. I knew the remains would last them a while. There was plenty to eat in the nursery. My greatest fear had become a reality. I survived. My child and the others were in there. Monsters. I couldn't do it alone, nor should I have. I had others who were the same as me, who needed my help. I considered them to be mine, my responsibility, my needed help in the darkness ahead. I went downstairs and opened up the cells of the new girls, his newest brides. I took them both upstairs and sat them down, both of them very good. So beautiful are you. I am so proud of you both to sit so poised after what you've gone through, I told them. They politely waited while I spoke, and then each of them assured me that they knew their place. They would do nicely. I smiled for them and poured them some tea. I knew when I married him that Don was a good man, but not a smart one. That's partly why I loved him. It's also why he was such a good fit for the Marathon County Sheriff's Department. Kind-hearted, followed orders, too happy obeying to ask questions. Exactly what you want in a cop. I fell in love with Don for a lot of reasons. He always stood up straight, always showered twice a day, ironed every shirt he wore. He was a proud man, and it was those little things he was proud of that I found so adorable. He was gentle, too, never raised a hand to anyone unless he absolutely had to. What didn't matter to me was that Don had never been the sharpest knife in the rack. I always knew Don wasn't smart. I didn't think he was stupid. I learned how wrong I was when he came home one night with that statue. When I asked him why on earth he'd bring evidence from a crime scene home in the first place, he told me he didn't know. I was sympathetic at first, not angry, not terrified like I am now. I thought he'd been unable to part with it because of some kind of post-traumatic stress. And like I said, my Don was kind-hearted. Soft was the word my father, who definitely isn't kind-hearted, used. That's another part of what made Don such a good cop in these parts, though. You needed softness when settling violent disputes between drunk couples or picking up strung-out tweakers from the curb all day. Especially when every perp knew you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Marathon County ain't the kind of place where nights like the one he found the statue happened. It was a triple homicide. Don had dealt with his share of murders, but never a multiple body count. I saw how rattled he was as soon as he almost fell through the door. I'd been married to him for almost 8 years, dating for 6 before that. High school sweethearts, that old chestnut. In none of those 14 journeys round the sun had I ever seen my man so pale, so shaking, so distraught. You know those photos of World War I soldiers with a 1,000-yard stare? Yeah. If you do, you'd seen the look my Don had on his face that night. He didn't say anything to me the entire evening. He sat down, put the statue on the table, downed a glass of water, and then went to bed. Not one single word in my direction. Didn't even meet my gaze. I didn't find out from Don what had happened, but from his boss, Sheriff Harworst, an old family friend, as most folk around here are. Harworst painted a grim picture over the landline. Don had answered a call about a domestic disturbance from one of the other apartments in that complex. He'd arrived to find the door to the crime scene, apartment 19, hanging from its hinges. You could smell the blood in the hallways, apparently, but did Don stop and call for backup? No, he didn't. Not my Don. Daddy called him soft, but Daddy was an idiot. Don was kind, warm, had no roughness to his edges. And what he didn't lack, though, was balls. That's another reason I loved him. He had, metaphorically speaking, the biggest cojones I'd ever known to a man to swing. A gentle, fearless giant. So yeah, I had no reason to doubt Harworst's recount of Don running into the apartment, firearm raised, ready to save a life, end one, or probably both. Harworst didn't arrive until later, after Don didn't radio back. They sent the whole armed unit. They feared the worst, but what they got was... well, it was worse than any worst folk around here usually imagine. Don hadn't answered because he was curled in the fetal position in one corner on the studio apartment. I'd never seen Don cry. Men around these parts don't, generally speaking. I didn't believe that part of Harworst's story until he described the carnage he found Don amongst. As I said, it was a triple homicide. Don't ask me who done it because they still didn't catch who did. The victims were all male, all tweakers too, most likely given the neighborhood Don found them in. Finding 3 bodies would have messed anyone up, and that's the truth. But Don was a cop. 3 bodies in and of themselves aren't usually enough to rattle cops, especially ones with a few years under his belt like he had. No, it wasn't finding 3 bodies that rocked my husband worse than I'd ever seen. It's what had been done to them before they died. The sicko who killed them had made some alterations. That's how Harworst described it to me before I'd sworn at him so much he gave up being coy about details. I must admit, I still regret browbeating him into the full truth. He's a good man, and by the time I put down the phone, I realized he hadn't been trying to withhold anything from me as some kind of commentary on the emotional fragility of my gender. He didn't want to talk it out in full because he was scared too. It was impossible to identify the victims for a simple reason. They'd had their faces removed. The killer had stripped back the flesh until nothing but bone and muscle remained. They'd been thorough, too. Tongues, jaws, teeth, eyes, noses. almost everything that wasn't the skull itself had been carved off. The wounds weren't clean either. They were jagged, ripped, the kind of wounds made slowly and painfully by a blade far too blunt for butchery. Harworth's vivid description of the meatless skulls was in itself enough to buckle my knee so bad I had to sit down. His recollection didn't stop there, though. The faceless corpses had been positioned kneeling in a circle, facing inwards. At its center was a compost heap of scraps of skin, bone, muscle, teeth, hair, eyes, all the offshoots and trimmings left over post-mutilation. Other parts had been removed, too. Every finger and toenail had been pulled out, hamstrings had gouged out, and discarded to keep them immobile. The swollen bruising meant they'd been made when they were alive by Harworth's reckoning. He also reckoned the horizontal gashes across each of their stomachs weren't made post-mortem, either. Disemboweled ain't a word I ever expected to hear in Marathon County, nor on our side of the TV screen, at least. The offcuts and offal of every wound and opening had been added to the mound of gore. I nearly puked when Harworth told me that there was enough of it stacked up to reach his waist. The walls of the studio apartment were caked in blood. Every bit of furniture was smashed, most thrown across the room judging from the dents and holes in the cheap plaster walls. A CD player had been left on, playing Gustav Holst's Mars on repeat, which Harworth sheepishly admitted he had to cross-reference to the track number against the list on the CD case to figure. They'd found Dawn curled in a ball amongst the carnage, sobbing at the incomprehensible violence and destruction around him. Harworth sent him straight back to the station to shower and head home. That's why he was calling, to check in. The sheriff didn't know about the statue. I figured at the time it would be best to keep it that way. Maybe Dawn wasn't the only idiot in this house. We didn't talk about the statue until the next morning. I didn't even register it that first night. My husband had come home traumatized by an event so horrific, I was traumatized just from listening to someone recount the traumatic details. That's 3 levels of trauma I was dealing with. Trauma cubed. Excuse me for caring more about my man's emotional well-being than some trinket he stole. I fell asleep holding Dawn while listening to him sob quietly. It was the first and only time I'd ever been the big spoon. He wasn't in my arms when I awoke. I found him downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, staring at the statue. That's when I noticed it properly for the first time. It was placed atop the mound of viscera when Dawn found it. It was made of a material that resembled jade, if jade was the bright orange of magma. It didn't feel like jade to the touch either. Despite looking smooth and polished, it felt rough. Rough doesn't feel like quite the right word, though. Charged is more appropriate. Almost like it felt how battery acid tastes. The statue was of 2 men standing back to back. They were, to put it delicately, huge. They were a level of swollen that nobody could argue was healthy, attractive, or in any way a shape human beings were meant to be. Their stomachs sagged to their knees, ankles folded around feet so tumor-like that the stubby toes poking from beneath them were barely visible. There was no part of them that didn't sag, bulge, or droop, and all of it had been captured in hideously accurate detail by the sculptor. Every pore was visible, every hair, thin wrinkle, and fold of skin plain to see. If the subject matter weren't so unsettling, I'd have said it was one of the best bits of art I'd ever seen. The sculptor hadn't given the orange jade men faces. They had heads, sure, but both were depicted wearing tight bags or sacks that obscured their features. What wasn't obscured were the painfully tight-looking lengths of barbed wire wrapped around the bags. Just looking at it made my face itch, my insides queasy. As I said, Dawn was staring at it when I found him downstairs. I asked him about it, and he said he didn't know why he picked it up. Shock, he reckoned. He couldn't stop thinking about it last night, he told me. The statue, not the incident. At the time, I figured the statue fixation was some kind of coping mechanism. I know better now. I was gentle the first time I told him to take it back to the station. Reminded him kindly that having it was technically illegal, but given the circumstances, Sheriff Harworst was sure to look the other way. Don agreed to take it back later that day, when he went down to the station to file his report of the previous night's incident now that he was calmer. For the rest of the first week, I genuinely believed that was the last I'd seen of it. And then the weekend came. Don and I had a Friday night date night agreement that was sacrosanct. Had been since high school. I'd given him a fair bit of slack during that first week. He was despondent, withdrawn, distant. Again, I put it down to the drama. That's the exact reason I picked his favorite restaurant, Mac's Steak and Brat Smackdown Buffet, for our meal. To cheer him up, and because he knew that I hate Mac's Steak and Brat Smackdown Buffet with a passion. You can imagine my anger when I was left waiting there like a jilted high school kid for 3 hours. I was willing to look past a lot, but failing to follow Friday night date night tradition wasn't on the list. Don was supposed to meet me straight from work as he did every week. I'm sure you can also imagine how much calling to find that he wasn't even there further stoked my itch. The final nail in my rage coffin was where I eventually did find him. More specifically, what I found him with. He was sitting at his desk in his study. You can probably already guess what I caught him doing. Staring at that statue. Don didn't jump, didn't flinch, didn't even blink when I threw open the door. It took a good 10 minutes of me yelling at him for him to mumble an apology. No amount of berating could conjure an explanation for why he'd not gone into work today or where he'd gone after I heard him leave the house that morning. I gave up digging for a reason why he still had the statue after an hour or two. I felt bad about my outburst. Don had gone through a lot, and when I calmed down, I rationalized that I'd probably been unrealistic in my expectations of how quickly he'd bounce back. I apologized, and he agreed to return the statue and speak to Harworst about some time off. I watched him take it with him in the car the next morning just to be sure. Again, I thought that was the last I'd seen of it. Don was still withdrawn and sullen for the next few weeks, but started to show flashes of his former self here and there. He didn't miss Friday night date night again, that's for certain. I'm not a snoop either, and I always like to give Don his privacy. But I have to admit, I did search his study once or twice when he was at work during that first week, just to make sure he'd actually made good on his promise. By the time the night of the incident was almost a month behind us, I had almost thought we were getting back to normal. That's when I got the second call from Harworst. Don hadn't returned to work since his week of recuperative leave. At first, I argued. I saw him leave the house every morning, I said, uniform and badge ready in his bag. It was when Harworst started mentioning how easy it was to lose said badge that I stopped playing incredulous wife and started listening proper. I didn't ask about the statue, both because I didn't want to get Don fired and because I already knew the answer. When Don got back from work, I was midway through tearing his study apart. He tried playing dumb at first until I mentioned the call from Harworst. He broke down at that and confessed at least to his lies about his whereabouts. I took what he said then as the truth. I still feel like a fool about that. He told me he'd been in bars drinking, that he couldn't forget about the incident. That's why he was so tired all the time, he told me, so withdrawn, so unfocused. I also bought the lie about him throwing the statue in a river. Well, no, I'm not giving myself enough credit here. I didn't believe him. I just wanted to. So much so that I made the unconscious decision to just leave it. To live in the fantasy land where my brave husband was a recovering alcoholic cop despite never smelling of booze or spending a dime. It only took 2 nights for that fantasy to come crumbling down. I was woken by a crash outside our window. Nothing major, you understand, probably just raccoons or the wind knocking some dead foliage our way. It was realizing that Dawn wasn't lying next to me that got my feet out of bed and treading as quiet as possible around the house. I heard him before I saw him, and because of that, I managed to see him without him seeing me. I don't know what would have happened if he had. I don't think I'd still be alive to tell this, that's for certain. He was standing in the downstairs bathroom facing the mirror. It was the look in his eyes that made tears instantly fall from my own, that clasped my hand to my mouth to stifle a terrified whimper. I'd never seen that look on my Dawn's face. I'd never seen it on anyone's. Evil. It's not a word I ever thought I'd find myself using in seriousness or outside of church. It's the only one I have, though. Dawn never smiled with his teeth. His reflection was grinning so wide I could see all of them, even the molars. His normally narrow eyes were stretched to perfect, bulging circles. Ventricles and veins pulsed on their surface, and his left eyelid twitched without warning in an erratic, arrhythmic pattern. His nostrils were flared almost to the point of being level with his cheekbones, brows raised until it crushed his forehead against his hairline. The muscles and folds of the version of my Dawn in that reflection were stretched back so far that if I couldn't see the back of his head from my perch on the first floor landing, I'd have sworn someone was holding him upright by the back of his head. He was talking to himself, repeating a single word over and over. Perfection. It's a word I'm all too familiar with now. But that night, it raised nothing but terrified confusion. He was dragging his razor across the mirror like he was trying to shave the face on the other side of it. Over and over, he dragged the blades across the glass. The squeaks and scrapes set my teeth on edge and the vertebrae of my spine to shudder. I couldn't stand to watch for more than a few minutes. As I said, the only word I have is evil. It wasn't light that danced in those bulging eyes. It wasn't the happy spark of joy I'd fallen in love with. What twinkled in Dawn's eyes that night was a cold, dead lust, a lifeless urge for things too foul for you or I to comprehend. A small part of me wishes I'd been carrying my phone, that I'd taken a photo. Unless you saw those eyes for yourself, it all probably doesn't make sense. In fact, I kind of hope it doesn't. If it does, and you've seen eyes like Dawn's, and your life is already or about to be as screwed as mine. I couldn't sleep that night. When Dawn eventually came back to bed a few hours later, I just laid trembling in the dark, waiting until his snoring started to burst into stifled sobs. I left a note when he went out the next morning, told him he needed to sort himself out and that I was going to stay with my sister to clear my head. I couldn't tell him the real reason I wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't close my eyes without seeing a version of his face so terrifying it made the thought of being around him induce a panic attack. A week went by and I started to get worried about the fact that he hadn't called. After a while, I started to think that maybe I'd been half asleep when I saw him, or that I dreamt it. I wish that were the case. Once again, my negativity turned inward and I started beating myself up over my overreaction. Dawn was unwell and I'd abandoned him, I told myself. I was a terrible wife. I'd left him alone when he needed me the most. My sister didn't share the view. She had made me promise not to go back to him groveling, not to make the first move, not to be the one that reaches out to break the ice. I broke that promise on the Saturday morning by phoning Dawn, and broke it again when I went home upon the call going straight to voicemail. It had been a week since I'd last stood in my living room. Looking at the state of it, Dawn had abandoned it himself not long after. The whole house was trashed. Every piece of furniture had been pulled apart or thrown across the room, or in some cases taken to with a sledgehammer by the looks of things. There were splatterings of blood here and there, pools of it forming around sharp metal edges and splintered wood where he'd pulled furniture and appliances apart with his bare hands. My tears started silently falling almost the exact moment I crossed the threshold into our once beautiful home. I couldn't allow myself to believe my Dawn, my gentle, caring Dawn, was capable of this level of wanton destruction, this carnage. I wouldn't believe it. I had to tiptoe over broken glass, wood, and plaster in almost every room. A thick cloud of dust sprang from wherever my foot fell, and there wasn't a single room that didn't stink of urine, rotting food, or both. He'd done that too, you see. He'd done it on our upturned couch, on the inside of our beaten-in fridge, and in the drawer where I kept our wedding photos. My tears weren't silent as the mental images grew more and more vivid. Each room gave enough new evidence for my imagination to make an ever-clearer montage of Don, with his bulging eyes and tooth-filled grin, ripping apart the life we'd built together in the most destructive, most barbaric way he possibly could. This was not my Don. Couldn't be. But it was. It was his study that broke me. When I found it, I could do nothing but fall to my knees and weep. Unlike the rest of the house, the study was more or less intact. In here, it seemed Don had decided to create rather than destroy. He'd built himself an effigy on his desk, a crude replica of two large, back-to-back figures I recognized immediately. I can't bring myself to say what he made them out of. My Don might be... well, he might be the reason all this happened, but I care enough for my memory of him that I won't conjure the mental image of him using his bare hands to make a sculpture out of... well, out of the other kind of body waste. I could smell it as soon as I reached the upper floor landing. It wasn't the disgustingness of it that pushed the last of my composure from me, no. It was the mental image of my once proud Don, of the bestial, primal, horrific thing he'd become. It was the thought of the man I admired above all others, broken, wretched, and weak. Despite my terror and anger at our destroyed home, all I wanted to do was help him. I could smell it as soon as I reached the upper floor landing. It wasn't the disgustingness of it that pushed the last of my composure from me. No. I was about to phone the only person I could think of, Harworst, when something on Don's desk made me pause. It was a receipt for a storage unit on the edge of town. I knew the address. A friend of ours kept some of her ex-husband's stuff there after a messy divorce. I should have listened to my gut. It was my gut that told me not to phone Harworst. It was my gut that told me to put my phone away, to go downstairs, to get back in the car. It was my gut that convinced me that I could help Don, that I could get through to him, and that once I found him at the storage unit, we'd reconcile and he'd get better, that all this could be put behind us. If anyone tells you to always trust your gut, don't listen to them. It was easy to find which of the few dozen storage units Don had rented. It was late by the time I arrived, and it was the only one in the lot with a light on. Even if it hadn't been, the weary old man in the booth was more than happy to throw the spare set of keys at me once I explained who I was. That creepy guy with the bulging eyes had come to visit his unit a few days back, and none of the booth attendants had seen him leave. When I questioned why the police hadn't called them already, the man in the booth scratched his chin, looking sheepish. They were scared of him, too scared to phone the cops. Seems ridiculous, right? It wouldn't if you'd seen the face in the mirror that night like I had. To me, the attendant's fear made perfect sense. I asked when Don, first took out rental on the unit. The man told me it had been a few weeks prior, conceding with the day Don had thrown that statue in the river. Obviously, I wasn't putting the dots together in my head. I'd blinkered myself to a lot that I should have seen coming, but I wasn't foolish enough to still believe that lie. As much as it made my stomach plummet, I knew that when I found Don, the orange jade effigy would be with him. I thanked the wiry attendant before heading in the direction of Don's unit. The man in the booth seemed sympathetic. He let me know gently but firmly that if I wasn't back in an hour, he would phone the police. Said he couldn't rest with my death on his conscience, no matter how scared of that creepy tweaker he was. I didn't argue. Don's unit, Unit 19 was at the very edge of the lot. I couldn't hear anything except for the distant groan of traffic and the faint crinkle of a chain-link fence catching in the wind as I approached. It was a cold night. This wasn't unusual with it being November, but for some reason I became acutely aware of it in the near silence. I could feel, hear, and see my rapid, shallow breaths. I managed to get at least 6 into each footstep, the fog of my lungs' warmth billowing from my lips. The handling to the door of Unit 19 was cold too, much colder than the air. It was the kind of frigid that meant it almost burned to the touch. If my fingers weren't already trembling when they wrapped around it, they would have been by the time I'd finished turning. The units themselves were quite spacious as far as storage units go. Each had 2 rooms, a short hallway where one entered, and accessible via an inner door at the hallway's other end where the storage area was. The storage area had a rolling garage door to allow goods in and out, of course, but this could only be opened from the inside. It was for the inner door that I needed the key. The walk from the outside door to the other end of the hallway was one of the longest of my life, mainly because in here, I could hear Don. He was bawling, not crying, not sobbing, bawling, like a toddler that lost its parents, and not in the at the grocery store way. He was completely unrestrained in a way that I don't think I've ever heard an adult, man or woman, shed tears. It was a sound of pure despair, one that you don't realize you're glad you've never heard of until you do. The emotions that swelled in my chest when I heard it were as strong as they were complex. Sympathy, fear, disgust, care. The need to save and the need to flee started an intense battle within me the moment those sniveling wails hit my eardrums. Don's choking moans made the writing on the walls 100 times more unsettling too, I'll tell you that for nothing. It must have taken him days. The same word across every inch of brick over and over and over. You can probably guess the word already. Perfection. What that word meant to Don, I wouldn't know until the inner door to the storage area creaked open. I had to get there first. Even though the hallway was only about 10 feet in length, this was still a challenge. The cries and retches echoing off of the dark bricks made putting one foot in front of the other a conscious effort. My mind wouldn't let me do anything but fixate on Dawn's reflection in the mirror, those eyes filled with her cold, dead lust. With every foot, the distance between the second door and I shrank. The pictures behind my eyes grew more vivid. Over and over, my sadistic conscience replayed the reel of Dawn smashing our possessions, of him urinating on our wedding album, of him tearing apart our house until his hands bled. Tears streaming down my face. Each one for the proud man I'd never known not to stand fully straight, for the sniveling, hunched creature I feared he'd become. After the key clicked in the lock, and the door to the storage area swung open, I knew straight away that the levels of terror in my anticipation were nowhere near enough. The smell hit me in the face like a sack full of drowned rats. I actually took a step back, gagging and trying to pull my shirt up over my mouth to cover my nostrils. It was the same stench as Dawn had left in the house, but magnified 1,000-fold. There were new layers to it here, though. Layers of mold, of decay, of rotting meat. There was no light on the other side. Light from the grimy bulb in the hallway barely made it half of a foot before the shadows consumed it. The stench wasn't the only thing to assault me from the shadows, though. With it came the flies. There were dozens of them, hundreds. If it hadn't been for Dawn's crying, I'd probably have heard their collective buzzing from the hall. I screamed, violently fanning my arms in front of me to stop any of the fat, black, buzzing lumps from finding their way into my mouth or nostrils. My anticipation was now a full-blown dread. Every artery thrummed from the sheer force of my frightened pulse. Fast, deep gulps oversaturated my brain with oxygen. Black spots started ticking in the corners of my vision. Consciousness threatened to leave. My knees were midway to buckling when a realization slammed a fresh load of adrenaline through my veins. The moment I'd screamed, Dawn had stopped. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I could hear him in the darkness. He was standing somewhere on the other side of the room. His breaths were slow, heavy, and ragged enough to hear even over the horde of insects I'd freed when I opened the door. When he did answer a further 2 times, I found my fingers tightening around my phone. Not to find help, but to find light. My palms were sweating so much that I nearly dropped the thing as I swiped the passcode onto the screen. My trembling index digit missed the button for the flashlight twice before finding it. The real screaming. The screaming that meant my ears were ringing for a solid week after that night. Started as soon as I did. The first thing the beam of phone light revealed was the floor. The concrete was caked in both the bodily exertions the stench led me to expect and large patches of dark red crust I recognized but really didn't want to. There were glistening chunks strewn across the floor, chunks of graying brown that wriggled with maggots. Some of the chunks had hair, others fingernails. One had a dead, glassy eye. In the center of the room was that statue. The floor beneath it was clear, immaculate even. Don had taken great care to ensure that none of his mess, the destruction left in the wake of the man he'd become, touched it. I would have picked up the darn thing and smashed it right there, but I had another priority. Even though I knew I'd find them here, the 2 orange figures weren't who I came for. Don was standing at the other end of the room facing the wall. The light crept up his naked, trembling body. Every inch climbed revealed a fresh wave of dread. My Don, who'd showered twice daily and took great pride in his self-maintenance, was caked in every substance spattering the floor. My beautiful Don, who'd never let himself slouch even an inch, now hunched over on a bent and crooked spine. My darling Don, covered head to toe in deep, pus-filled scratches, burns, and blisters. The full image of the back of his naked body was too much. I yelled something. I forget what. What I said isn't important. What's important is the sound of words coming from my mouth startled me. Startled me so much that I dropped the phone. I was only in the dark for a few seconds. I dropped to my knees to search around in the muck almost before I'd heard the clattering squelch of it hitting the floor. I found it in no time at all, pulling myself to my feet and pointing the light once more in front of me. Straight into a pair of bulging dead eyes and a grin that showed every tooth. Somehow, I didn't repeat my clumsy mistake when I fell over backward. The phone stayed in my hand, the horror-revealing beam of light locked on the monstrous figure that was once my husband. Even hunched and crooked, he towered over me. The look in his eyes let me know what I needed to. That it was over. That it had been the moment he was unlucky enough to be the cop who answered the call to that apartment. I remember begging him to get it over with, for him to kill me and end this nightmare. He didn't say anything back. He just stood there, caked in depravity, grinning down at me with that evil face. I wish I could say that it wasn't Dawn, but it was. Something in me knew that my Dawn, my beautiful Dawn, wasn't trapped by that face. It was his, no less so than the soft little half-smile I fell in love with. He wasn't possessed. He hadn't been taken over or inhabited by some entity. This was him now. This was my Dawn. This is what he had become, what he always would be. In my mind's eye, I could see him pouncing. I tensed, ready to fight him off as he tried to tear me apart with his bare hands. The moment never came. Twisted as it sounds, part of me still wishes it had. All these years later. What he did instead was far, far worse. With a single fluid motion, Dawn reached with both hands and grabbed the back of his head. Grinning down at me, left eye twitching, he muttered one single word. Perfection. And then he pulled. My screaming had been caught in my throat while I was down on the floor with the dried blood, urine, and feces. It found its way back out as Dawn's muscular forearms wrenched his scalp. Even though my lungs were hitting decibels they never had, I could still hear the tearing. It started at his neck, a thin line of scarlet born on the bulge of his throat that flashed up to his jawline within a fraction of a second. the wet, crackling snaps of flesh prizing itself apart. Grew louder the further Dawn's arms stretched from his skull. His scalp, hair, and face went with them. I retched at the sight of his eyes rolling back in their sockets, vanishing from view as the face around them went limp and sagged. Within a few seconds, he dragged the skin off his head and clean off, sliding it from bone and muscle as easily as removing a hood. Exposed teeth, bulging lidless eyes, gaping open nostrils. None of the nightmare-inducing anatomical horrors I'd expected were waiting for me under this facial skin Dawn tossed over his shoulder, like a wet paper towel. This next part I know sounds impossible and is the exact reason I've spent the last 5 years in St. Dionysus' home for the incurably mad. This might be the only chance I get to tell my story, though. And I'm not going to leave anything out. Underneath Dawn's freshly removed face were 2 heads where one should have been. 2 squashed heads that writhed and undulated to separate themselves and inflate to their full size. 2 heads wrapped tight in orange plastic bags. Bags kept in place by constricting lengths of rusted barbed wire. I was already running to the door by that point, although my feet found it difficult to find purchase with all the muck all over the floor. More than once, I fell over in those few seconds before I finally found the hall. I got far too many glimpses of those two things clawing their way out of Dawn's body. Somehow, he didn't buckle until the very end. The 2 barbed-wired crowned lumps clawed and fought their way from his neck, both against Dawn's flesh and each other. His chest and torso bulged and stretched as they pulled more of themselves from whatever hell they'd risen from. I heard ribs cracking as one of the orange-head twins wrenched an arm free. The back of my neck felt warm wetness as the other one punched through Dawn's stomach with a gnarled foot. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop myself from taking one last mortified look over my shoulder before I started running until they found me on the freeway 3 days later with bleeding feet. The 2 figures from the statue were standing above their likeness. Dawn was gone. Completely eviscerated. I don't know how and I don't know why, but they'd used him as some kind of portal or opening or gateway. I love to think that wasn't what he wanted, but I still remember that face. His face. I think that was his plan all along. The moment he found that statue, it had its hold on him. I think this was always his endgame. The 2 men he'd birthed into the world with his madness would have dwarfed him. Each was easily over 7 feet tall and nearly as wide. Even over the stench left by Dawn's activities, I could smell the rancid mucus that covered them, the acid ammonia burning that oozed from them with each of their labored, bag-covered breaths. As I said, I wish I'd never looked back. Now every time I shut my eyes, the first thing I see is that image of them standing there in the blood and fecal matter and urine. Of one of them raising their tumorous hand and pointing at me. The next few years are a blur. By the time the waking nightmares started to subside, I'd already been here at St. Dionysus for several years. I'd apparently been pretty difficult, let's say, during my time here. It's taken another few years for them to trust me with a pen. I've bribed one of the orderlies. He's gonna spread my message. Get it out there, put it online. Everyone thinks that I killed Dawn and all those people. I was too out of it to give my side of the story. I need people to know. I need you to know what really happened. I don't want to say what I bribed him with. I don't have much. You can use your imagination. Please. Make it worth it. I need the world to know. Not just because I'm innocent, but because those things, they're still out there. They have been all this time. If they could corrupt someone like my Don, make him do... None of you are safe. None of you. I hope the orderly makes good on his end of the bargain. I hope my message gets out. I was going to tell you my name, but there's no point. You don't believe me anyway, do you? I'll know my story's out there, and that's enough. I hope you listen, because one day you might find a statue of two back-to-back men that feels like battery acid tastes. You might feel tempted to take that statue, to keep it. Please, even if you don't believe me now, when you find that statue, leave it be. Walk away from it. Pretend you never saw it and live your life. And if you see the two men with their bags and barbed wire, well, I'm sorry. But it's probably already too late.
Good evening, everyone. Giggles the Croupier here. Just wanted to thank all of my incredible patrons for supporting me. Tam B, Jen Miser, Skymara Ravenswood, Melissa Perez, Bernard Jackson, Leaf Ninja, Roy Larimer, Mr. Creepypasta, Neon Scoundrel, and William Delphin. I'm still figuring out rewards for Patreon, but if you would still like to support, click the link in the description, and I will hopefully have something for you soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Now, I'm all for long baths. I can spend up to 2 hours having a good soak. But I'm a veteran bather. My husband, on the other hand, had only just started. Almost 4 hours had passed since I got home, and he was still there. When I returned home from work that evening, I was surprised to hear water splashing in the bathroom. The sound resembled ripples and made it obvious it was coming from the bathtub. It wasn't like my husband didn't bathe, of course. It was just he always preferred showers. I, on the other hand, adored baths. Our tub was designed with 2 people in mind, but I always relished in having it to myself and my glass of wine. "I'm home," I called, dropping my bag onto the floor and making my way towards the bathroom.
Oh, hey, honey. Hold on a moment.
I slowed my pace, wondering what on earth was going on. So while I was sure it wasn't locked, I didn't want to disrespect him by barging in anyway. What are you up to?" I asked, placing my hand on the handle. I could hear water sloshing and the squeak of the bathtub as he moved.
Okay, you can come in now.
I pressed down the handle and pushed the door open. The first thing I noticed was the foggy mirror. In fact, the whole room seemed to be enshrouded in a cloud of steam. My husband was sitting in the bath, which was overflowing. Foam was crawling down the side of the tub into a puddle on the floor.
Hey,
He grinned at me.
how was work?
I wasn't even listening. The sight was so peculiar. I wanted to laugh. Not once during our 10 years of marriage did my husband express any desire to take a bath, and yet now here he was, submerged to his chin with half the bathroom afloat. "Finally came around, huh?" I asked, giggling. He smirked.
Yeah, I thought I'd finally see what the fuss is about.
Water was seeping onto the floor at his slightest movement. Isn't that too much water?" I suggested, nodding towards the expanding puddle on the floor.
No,
He shook his head.
it's the perfect amount.
Well, I was planning on taking a bath myself, so how about I get in too? To my surprise, he sat up straight, sending more water over the edge.
No,
He said alarmed, and then added in a calmer tone.
I'd really prefer to be alone.
I blinked at him. Oh, well, all right. Take your time. I shut the door and proceeded into the kitchen. I'll admit, I felt slightly dismayed about not being involved. I mean, it wasn't like my husband and I were attached at the hip, but I figured he wouldn't object to having me there. I wanted to bathe too, after all. Oh well. I presumed I'd just have to wait until he got out. Except he didn't. Now, I'm all for long baths. I can spend up to 2 hours having a good soak. But I'm a veteran bather. My husband, on the other hand, had only just started. Almost 4 hours had passed since I got home, and he was still there. Are you okay? I asked, peeking through a crack in the door. Do you need anything? He jumped at the sound of my voice.
No! No, I'm totally fine.
Aren't you hungry? I asked, perplexed. I'm making lasagna.
No. No, thank you. I ate a while ago.
And that was it. I ate alone that evening. I could hear intermittent sounds of the tap being turned on and off, and presumed it was because the water was getting cold. It was almost 10 p.m. when I finished washing up and felt tired enough to go to bed. Isn't that enough for one day? I asked as I entered the bathroom to take off my makeup. Let's go to bed. The puddle on the floor had expanded and fully saturated the mat.
No, this is great.
He retorted dryly, angling the shower head at the water to make more foam.
You go. I'll join you later.
Your skin is going to look terrible. Look how pruny it is, I said, gesturing at his fingers. And what about the water bill? He pursed his lips.
We can afford it.
I went to bed distraught. Was this some kind of ploy to get back at me for always hogging the bath? Was he trying to teach me a lesson? If he was, it was definitely working. I woke up at 2 a.m. that night and immediately felt my husband's side of the bed. It was empty. Jeez. Did he fall asleep in the bath? I got out of bed and tiptoed towards the bathroom. It was silent. I pushed the door open slightly and peered inside. My husband was fast asleep, but from where I was standing, it looked like his nose was submerged in water. Panicked, I pushed the door open with a loud bang and he jumped up in fright, sending a huge wave of water overboard. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "You could have drowned!" He seemed disoriented but held his own.
I'm not gonna drown, Martha. Just go back to bed.
Okay, why aren't you getting out of the bath? What's wrong? He looked disheveled and his eyes were red and glassy.
Go back to bed.
His tone was icy and made it abundantly clear he wasn't in the mood to talk. So I did. My husband was about 3 times my size. So what was I meant to do? Pull him out of the bath? I woke up early the following morning and headed straight to the bathroom. My husband was already awake, watching me slyly as I entered. The entire room smelled foul, and I couldn't help noticing a lump of brown treading through the foam. Okay, either you get out right now, I said sternly, or I'm calling an ambulance. He shot me a pleading look.
But don't call anyone. I promise I'll be out before you get back from work.
I'm not going to work. It's Saturday. His eyes widened and I realized this was news to him.
I can't do this anymore.
He whispered, his eyes welling up with tears. I stared at him, unsure of what to say.
Honey,
he began.
I wanted to keep you out of it.
What? I snapped, but he pressed a finger to his lips.
I was planning to deal with it until you got home last night. But I ran out of time.
I felt a chill crawling up my spine. Ran out of time to do what?
To get rid of...
He sobbed.
Her.
My heart was in my throat.
She drowned. And I couldn't bear for you to see. I
shook my head. Who drowned? My husband buried his face in his hands and then reached beneath the foam and pulled up a handful of hair. I reeled backwards, gagging.
I wanted to wait until you went to work, so you never had to see it.
I leaned on the doorframe to steady myself.
You mustn't tell anyone.
He whispered.
They'll take me away.
Silent tears were flowing down my cheeks.
Please, don't cry, Martha. I'll do anything.
He pleaded.
Whatever you like.
I tried my best to compose myself, wiping my blotchy face with my sleeve. I sniffled. I'd like to take a bath.